Thank you. Thank you very much, Rory, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of you. So I will be sharing my screen, correct, Rory?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I hope you can see that.
Perfect.
Okay, let me go in presentation mode. And indeed, in my presentation, I will be speaking to you about essentially what we have been doing on vaccines and therapeutics, but keeping a focus more on vaccines. But of course, many of the considerations that I will bring up here in terms of the activity of the EMA during this pandemic can also be considered as well for what we've done with therapeutics. And I will be happy anyway to take later on any question specific to therapeutics as well. So I will start by saying that when the pandemic started, and even before then, when there were the first cases spotted in China of this atypical pneumonia, we activated the EMA health threat plan, which foresaw the creation of an expert task force as a small group of people within the European network with expertise in the area of infectious disease, virology, and vaccines in order to rapidly come up with some ideas on how to tackle from a regulatory standpoint the development of medicines for this pandemic and for this new coronavirus. And this has been instrumental in the dialogue that started immediately and even before, as I said, the declaration of the pandemic, in order to have continuous engagement with those that were bringing up vaccines and therapeutic in the context of the pandemic, and in order to prevent and treat the consequences of the infection of this virus. So this group is in place now since more than a year and is continuing providing really relevant input to the EMA as a whole in terms of agile, rapid, and timely feedback on the scientific aspect related to the development of vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19. Another important element that we brought forward in the context of this pandemic in order to allow really a fast review of all the data and with a timely regulatory decision has been the concept of the rolling review. So while normally we would wait that all the data with respect to the development of a new medicinal product are generated and only then submitted to us and reviewed, here we allow that once any piece of evidence was created or any study completed, it was submitted straight away to us so that we could start the review of this data, so that when the last bit of data were to be submitted, we would then be ready to come up with an opinion and conclude on the benefit risk of the product. And therefore, if everything was supposed to be okay, then issue a positive benefit risk and an approval of the vaccine or the therapeutics. So in other words, this way of working allowed us to be very fast in reviewing in a timely way all the data as they become available, so that we could come up rapidly with a decision on these products. And indeed, this is, is the schematic that shows you exactly what happens between a standard regulatory review of a dossier for approval versus the rolling review cycle. And you can clearly see here that by the time the last bit of information is submitted, then we could come up with an opinion in a much shorter time frame than what normally would have happened. And this allowed us to be much faster in approving vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19 than what normally would have been expected, thanks to this approach of rolling review. This is an overview just of what happens in the preclinical space and then during clinical trials with phase 1, 2, and 3 studies, which are becoming larger and larger until there is the evaluation of all this data and then a possible approval with the scale up of the manufacturing, and then the very important activity in the post-approval phase related to the monitoring of safety and effectiveness of vaccines and therapeutics. A lot of discussion has been taking place around how to design clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines. And when discussing with international regulators, we all agreed that it was important to have large clinical trials that demonstrate the ability of the vaccines to prevent symptomatic disease as main measure of benefit. So if we can see that there is less disease with symptoms in people giving vaccine compared to another arm in which they receive placebo, that would be really good evidence to show that the vaccines is working and is protecting people from COVID-19. There are other elements that were not really possible to gather sufficient evidence at the time of approval, such as long-term protection, as indeed these studies were able to recruit a sufficient number of cases to really determine the efficacy of the vaccine in the short term, but we need also to follow up what happens in the long term and for how long the vaccines are able to protect. Another important element, whether the vaccines are able to prevent from a symptomatic infection, and therefore what is the impact on transmission of the virus in the community. And all these very important endpoints can only be addressed in larger studies in the post-approval phase, which is what is happening right now for the vaccines that have already been approved. And we will be gathering more evidence in this respect, which is extremely important in order to understand what will be the time frame for returning to normal life and returning to a normal way of dealing with other people, and if the social distance measure can be relaxed. All these studies, as said, recruited really a large number of adults. So most of the studies were about 30,000 participants, just to give you a rough idea of what we've seen so far. Ideally, we push developers to include, to a large extent, elderly above the age of 65 years of age, because as you know, those are those most suffering from the deadly consequences of this virus, and the burden of disease is mainly associated with the elderly. So it was considered extremely important to have sufficient evidence to really tell us to what extent the vaccines were able to protect also the elderly. In terms of younger ages, some studies have included adolescents above 16 years of age. However, the majority did not for the time being, and preferred to wait for the outcome of the adult studies and really to understand the benefit risk in the context of the use in adult population before moving to studies in pediatric population before the age of 18. And indeed, there will be dedicated studies that will be looking into younger children, starting from adolescents and going down then to younger children. Also, minorities were represented in some of these studies. As we regulators, we really push for this to happen. We really wanted the studies to be as inclusive as possible, to really tell us whether there is any difference in terms of protection across different groups, and also including vulnerable groups. The follow-up should have been at least for 6 weeks after the last dose of vaccine. And as you know, many of these vaccines require a 2-dose schedule. And we felt very important to have at least this time frame, because we know that most side effects would occur within 6 weeks after the last dose. So very important to have, at the time of the initial approval, evidence in this regard. However, the trial should be designed in order to look for safety and efficacy for a period of at least 1 year, because we felt very important, as said before, to have data on the long-term protection, but also to be sure that we are able to collect information on the long-term safety as well. So this is what normally would happen in terms of vaccine development. And you see here that in a standard approach to vaccine development, all the various steps and stages throughout the development plan are done in a sequential way, and even sometimes taking a pause from one phase to the other. So starting from looking into the initial pharmaceutical quality, doing non-clinical research, then entering into the clinical trials from the phase 1 study, which are the smallest study looking into the first safety in humans and also defining the dose, and then testing larger clinical trials, which are the phase 2 study, and then the pivotal phase 3 trials, which are the one that I just described to you in the context of COVID. Then there is the approval, and the large-scale production just starts after the end of the phase 3 trials, and after approval, studies are conducted post-approval to really determine whether there is safety in the large population and also effectiveness. Here is, on the contrary, what happened in the context of COVID-19. So as you can clearly see, everything has happened almost sequentially, or to a large extent, there was overlap among the different phases. This has allowed to move very rapidly and give us vaccines in less than 1 year time, while normally it will require up to 10 years or even more to have vaccines from early development to approval. But it's important for me to stress that this has happened without really cutting corners in terms of the amount of evidence that has been generated. So the only difference, as said, is that a lot of these studies have been conducted in parallel instead of sequence. And this is taking some risk in terms of what could have happened in the next stage. But at the same time, when all the data were ready for approval, we had the same level of evidence that normally we get whenever a vaccine is authorized. So I think this has been quite a tremendous achievement and really great for us to get all this evidence when we were ready for approving these vaccines. And this has happened because a lot of resources were mobilized simultaneously, and not only from the regulatory side with international collaboration, and Dr. St Ramon will talk to you later about this, but also in terms of what developers have been doing, collaborating also with governments, with academia, in order to make sure that it was possible to move rapidly throughout the various phases of vaccines development in order to deliver vaccines in less than a year time, which has never happened in human history. And also the other important point is that the manufacturing, while normally it would start to be ramped up only after approval, here it started even before approval. So taking additional risk in starting to ramp up manufacturing without knowing if the vaccines at the end could have been approved. And we may wonder that maybe even more of these scale up should have been taking place at risk. However, it's for me important to stress that a lot of efforts has been put in this, and really we are seeing here something that has been rather unprecedented and has helped at least having some doses available straight away after approval, which is not something that we normally see during traditional vaccine development. If we look now at where we are with the vaccines, at least in terms of what has been approved by the EMA in the European Union, as said, this is a graph that illustrates a bit what has happened throughout the last year, starting from the WHO declaration of the pandemic, and as said, the creation of this COVID-19 expert task force from the EMA, the study straight away to look into how to speed up the development of vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19. And throughout this year, we have been in continuous dialogue with the developers that submitted to us their proposal for how to develop vaccines and therapeutics. And we have given constantly and rapidly feedback and a regulatory steer on what we would like to see in terms of minimal evidence in order to approve these vaccines and therapeutics. And in terms of vaccines, here we see that we approved 4 vaccines so far. These vaccines have been approved according to the conditional marketing authorization, which is an authorization that takes into account that more data will be submitted post-approval in order to then transform this conditional marketing authorization into a full marketing authorization. And so far, we have 4 vaccines that you see here, the Comirnaty mRNA vaccine, the Moderna messenger RNA vaccine as well, and 2 viral vector vaccines from AstraZeneca and Janssen. So as said, the Comirnaty and the Moderna vaccines are messenger RNA vaccine in the sense that they are based on this technology, which is a messenger RNA sequence that contains the instruction and the code for producing the spike protein from the SARS-CoV-2, so the virus that is causing this pandemic. So once it enters into the cell in the human beings, the cell transforms this code into the actual spike protein, exposes on the surface and releases. So that mimics exactly what happens when we get infected with a virus and produce a really sustainable and remarkable immune response that confers protection. The other two vaccines that have been approved, so the AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccine, they use another technology in order to deliver this instruction and code for the spike protein, and they use a non-replicated adenovirus, which is an innocuous virus that is made unable to replicate. This virus infects our cells, transmits the code and the instruction for creating the spike protein from the SARS-CoV-2, that then again is expressed on these cells and they trigger an immune response that confer protection. These vaccines do not contain the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 itself, and they cannot cause the disease. So they just contain the instruction for generating the spike protein, which is the most important immunological antigen present on the surface of this virus, and really the one that drives the immune response that gives protection against this virus. And you see here the timetable of when all these vaccines have been approved, starting from the first one, which is the BioNTech Pfizer on the 21st of December 2020, and then to the last one, which is the Janssen vaccine, which has been approved on the 11th of March this year. So all the COVID vaccines that are approved in the European Union, they demonstrated a positive benefit-risk balance in the prevention of COVID-19 vaccine. This has been demonstrated in clinical trials for the messenger RNA vaccine, showing very high efficacy in preventing symptomatic COVID-19 of any severity, but also the viral vector vaccine demonstrated convincingly protection against symptomatic COVID, and this was the basis for demonstrating their benefit. Since the vaccines have been studied in different trials, it is not possible to make a crude and direct comparison of the efficacy rates reported in all these clinical trials. We are often tempted to show that one vaccine had 95% efficacy, other 70, other 60% of efficacy, but we have to be extremely careful in doing that because these vaccines have been studied in different clinical trials, in different geographies, different point in time. Different endpoints were used in order to demonstrate or to show when PCR testing was needed after symptoms were emerging. And also importantly, different attack rates took place during these clinical trials. So therefore, while differences might be there, we have to be extremely careful in not overinterpreting these numbers and make direct comparison. These studies also showed some hints about the prevention of severe disease, hospitalization, and death, even if we had really limited data from these trials, despite they were very large. But indeed, they all are showing a trend towards high level of protection, which is very reassuring. And also, there are limited information from most of these clinical trials with respect to protection against the emerging variants. However, some of these studies, like the recent Janssen one, showed to us, since the study was conducted also in South Africa and in Brazil, that there is still protection retained against some of these variants, at least some of the ones that are most of concern, which I think it's very good news. And we're looking forward getting also more data from the other vaccines with respect to ability to protect from the variants. And in this sense, real-world data will be extremely important, not only with respect to protection against the variant, but also in order to tell us more about protection against infection. And some of the preliminary data that we're seeing, like from Israel, are very reassuring, but we need more data for a proper estimation of the level of protection that this vaccine could confer for infection and transmission. Talking about safety, again, we have seen a good safety profile for all these vaccines, which is comparable to other vaccines that have been approved and are in use for other diseases. Most common side effects are usually mild or moderate and temporary. This includes really local or systemic reactogenic adverse events like tenderness and pain at the injection site, headache, tiredness, muscle pain, chills, fever, joint pain, or nausea. And as said, they always go away after a couple of days on average. Very rare but severe allergic reactions have occurred in people receiving the vaccines. These are occurring in less than 1 in 100,000 people, and that's why you have to monitor carefully people after vaccination for at least 15-30 minutes to be sure that nothing is happening in terms of severe allergic reaction, particularly in people that had an history of anaphylaxis or severe allergic reaction. Most recently, we have seen very rare events of severe thrombosis combined with thrombocytopenia after the AstraZeneca vaccination, which have occurred in around 1 in a million people, even if now we are revisiting the number of cases and we will have better estimate of what is the actual incidence of this adverse event. And these events are currently under investigation to understand if they are really caused from the vaccines or whether they occur just by causal relationship, so that they are, if they are not really related at all to the vaccine, which we don't know yet, but we are really investigating them to really understand what is happening and to really understand what could be the link with the vaccines, and importantly, what could be the mechanism so that we can fine-tune risk minimization measure in order to ensure a safe use of this vaccine. Of course, long-term safety is being monitored, and we will gather more information in this respect. All the scientific details and the product information around these vaccines are on the EMA webpage, and you can find here links that you can look into in order really to find the assessment history for all these vaccines and the current product information to healthcare professionals and patients on the use of the vaccines that have been approved so far. As said, data from real world are important to complement clinical trial data, and we are gathering right now as we speak some of this data, but more will come in the near future. And real world data can inform vaccination campaigns and could also make changes in the current practices depending on what they're telling us and what is the solidity of this data. This study will provide information on how long protection lasts, how well the vaccine prevents severe COVID-19, including hospitalization, admission to ICU, and mortality. Also, how well it protects vulnerable groups such as the immunocompromised and pregnant women, for which we have very limited information so far from the clinical trials. And as said, they could play an important role in telling us to what extent vaccines are able to prevent asymptomatic cases and to block transmission, which is very important from a public health perspective. Studies in children has said so far only Comirnaty, so the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, has an approval from 16 years of age, while the other vaccines are approved for adults only for the time being. But indeed, studies in pediatric population have started already, particularly for the adolescents, and we hope very soon to assess some of this data so that we can enlarge the indication for use to cover also adolescents and in the future also younger children. And probably the messenger RNA vaccine will be the first one to come for an approval in this sense, and we're looking forward assessing all this data. Another important aspect is variants. As you know, this virus is already changing, and variants of concern have emerged in various parts of the world. And we have to be prepared, first of all, in monitoring what is the vaccine performance over time against this variant, so that we can spot immediately whether we got any problem with the level of protection conferred by the current vaccines against the variants that are emerging. And in this sense, we need maybe to think about updating the vaccine composition if the variants that are emerging are particularly problematic and they could escape immunity from the vaccine. And this is the reason why we have set up a number of requirement that would allow the rapid approval of any new vaccine that will be based on the variants after an initial approval of the prototype vaccine against the ancestral strain. This has been agreed with different regulators all over the globe, and it's very important that we are proactive and set up exactly what is needed to approve rapidly these vaccines. And in principle, we have agreed that we do not need large clinical trials. So clinical trials that will be comparing the immune response between people vaccinated with the parent vaccine and people vaccinated with the variant vaccine could be sufficient in order to allow us to determine what would be the benefit of this vaccine and to approve them in a swiftly manner. As you know, many variants are circulating. Like in Europe, the B.1.1.7 variant is now the predominant variant. The good news is that the data that we have so far from the laboratories, real-world evidence, and some clinical trials are showing that all the vaccines will be able to protect from this variant. So this is really good news and very important to have this information. Other variants, as you know, have been emerging, like the variant B.1.351 that emerged from South Africa. And here, the data that we have so far are limited, but are showing that possibly, at least from laboratory study, the sera from vaccinated individuals with many of these vaccines will be still able to confer cross protection. However, maybe this cross protection will not be at the same level for all these vaccines, and some vaccines may have reduced protection against this variant. However, we need robust data because we cannot exclude that all these vaccines will still be able to protect from severe disease caused by this variant. So we need more data in terms of clinical trials and real-world evidence to really ascertain what is the level of protection against hospitalization and severe disease against a variant like the B.1.351, but also the variant P1 that has been emerging from Brazil and shares a lot of the key mutation in the spike protein as well as the B.1.351. So the immediate benefit for people who will be protected against COVID-19 symptoms is the obvious one emerging from the use of this vaccine. And if fewer people are getting sick, particularly among high-risk individuals, such as the older people, this will alleviate the huge burden of COVID-19 disease on healthcare system and is the primary goal of the vaccination campaigns today, which is indeed reducing the burden of disease, reducing the hospitalization and mortality. And this should remain the focus in this phase of the pandemic. The preliminary data that are coming live from the real-world evidence from Israel and also from the UK to a certain degree are showing that high vaccination rates and infection rates are falling, providing first evidence that the vaccines are able to reduce the spread of the virus and the transmission. This is very important evidence because if we show that aside from the primary scope of preventing the burden of disease, also preventing transmission of the virus will be very important in order to return to normal life and to prevent that the virus will spread and mutate and cause further trouble by the variant that might be emerging. So the COVID-19 vaccine that reduce symptomatic disease are essential to beat the pandemic and will be really a crucial aspect in order to achieve a return to normal life. However, while the vaccines are being rolled out and vaccination campaigns are taking place, it's very important that we maintain prudent social distance measures and we continue to use face masks and be sure that we will not allow the virus to spread, particularly in this phase. Once most of us will be vaccinated, then probably it will be the time of getting rid of all these social distancing measures and return to normal life, but not as yet. So we should not force things through right now. Just to give you a summary of what we've been doing so far, at least for vaccines, we have interacted with 54 vaccine developers so far. 30 companies came to us to discuss their plans for vaccines with our EMA task force. 32 rapid scientific advice were discussed and agreed. We have been issuing guidance for developers on variant vaccines and clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines. And we have been discussing how to approve the next generation vaccines that may have problem in conducting placebo-controlled trials. As said, we are discussing how to conduct post-authorization studies for monitoring effectiveness and safety of the vaccine in large population. And you will hear more later about international collaboration, including with WHO and other regulators. So to conclude, all approved vaccines in the EU have been shown to offer a good level of protection against the COVID-19 disease of any severity. Preliminary real-world data are suggesting that the vaccines are also able to reduce transmission, severe disease, and hospitalization, which are crucial public health goals for the vaccination campaigns. Most side effects are mild to moderate in severity and are gone within a few days, but of course we are monitoring carefully what is emerging, including these severe cases of thrombocytopenia associated with thrombosis, at least with the AZ vaccine. All these vaccines have been granted conditional marketing authorization, which means the company must provide more evidence to EMA in the post-approval phases. The variants are emerging, as you know, and vaccine may need to be updated in order to cope with these variants. And we proactively started working with developers to find a way of swiftly approving these variant vaccines. Vaccination remains critical to control the pandemic, and we should work to make sure that the vaccines continue to be efficacious, safe, and available all over the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cavaleri, for your presentation, an extremely valuable one. And it truly outlines the unprecedented effort that has taken place to produce safe and effective vaccines in such a short period of time. It's truly remarkable, and I know will be of great interest to all of our network from across Southeast Asia and around the world. I will make a note to our participants that we would ask you to pose your questions to our speakers in the chat box, and specifically to address your questions to my colleague, Dr. Sabai Pugh, our on-site technical assistance expert for the region. So that's Sabai Pugh, S-A-B-I, and last name P-H-Y-U. So you'll see her name in the chat box, and please address your questions to her, which she will then relay to our speakers after our next presentation. Thank you very much for that. So without further ado, I will introduce our second speaker, Dr. Agnès St Ramon, and she will be presenting on the international collaboration in times of COVID-19. Dr. St Ramon is a French national and head of division, International Affairs, European Medicines Agency. Dr. St Ramon is a medical doctor and a qualified pediatrician. She has worked as a pediatrician in a pediatric hospital in Paris, France, then in the pharmaceutical industry, followed by the French Medicines Agency. In the year 2000, she joined the European Medicines Agency and was responsible for orphan medicines, scientific advice, the Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises Office, and Pediatric Medicines sector, implementing the EU regulation on pediatric medicines. In 2013, she became head of the Portfolio Board Division, providing oversight of projects for EMA. Since November 2016, she has also been the EMA head of the International Affairs Division. So Dr. St Ramon is very well placed to share her experience on international collaboration during COVID-19. And thank you once again for your availability to be with us today. Over to you, Doctor.
And thank you, Daniel, for presenting the slide on my behalf. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure after Marco's presentation on the content and the vaccine and brilliant presentation on explaining so well what has happened at the agency. My role is to present to you the complement, the support we provide to the agency when it comes to talking to other regulators, which is something we do nearly every day. There's a very common question from industry. They generally tell us, oh, but do you speak to FDA in the US? Do you speak to Canada? Yes, we do. We do nearly every day. Next slide, please. So just a reminder for those who are less familiar with EMA, EMA is an EU agency which works with 27 member states, but also 3 associated countries, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And we represent probably more than 20% of the global sales of medicines. And out of interest, we work in 24 languages. So all our documents, in particular the one intended for the patient and healthcare professionals, are translated systematically. Next slide, please. So we are, by nature, as a European agency, already an international body because we have all these member states to make to work together, which is sometimes easy, sometimes less easy, and also trying to make sure that we collaborate on a daily basis. So we are 15 months after the pandemic, as Marco said, and where are we today in terms of what we've been doing? Next slide, please. So we had 3 levels, I would say, of response. Marco has presented the content of the EMA emergency response. And we also had interaction, of course, with the member states themselves and with the European Commission, with granting, for example, the marketing authorization, so the formal decision, administrative decision on the benefit risk assessment that we do. But we have also developed a lot of interaction at international level, which started by a cooperation but became very soon a collaboration. And I can tell you we've progressed so much that it's inconceivable today to think that we will go back to not collaborating in the future. Next, please. So in terms of emergency response, Marco has presented, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but based on our existing EU health threat plan, we were able to start immediately at EMA because it started in February, so very early in the process. We set up the emergency response, and there was an internal emergency task force which comes with the member state assessors, staff from EMA, and we are doing these rolling reviews that Marco has presented. Internally, we also had a number of topics to address, and we set up a steering group which was looking at, for example, the protection of the staff itself. So what do? We had, hand sanitizer, mask, distance. We decided to let fewer people in the building. All this, recommend not to take public transport. So all these elements were also necessary. A lot of communication. And we also got report from the various task force to try to make sure that we were always linked to what was happening on the scientific move. Remember that we had just gone through 2 moves and the Brexit situation, which had taken a lot of our resources. So it was also a sort of very difficult exercise of finding the resources, freeing resources from other activities to free them to be able to work on the pandemic. So that was quite an exercise of gymnastics, I would say, but I think we've managed reasonably well. Next slide, please. So at the European level, in relation to so we were, for the assessment, we were working on with already the member state, as I said, because in our daily business, the assessors come from the member states. We coordinate their assessment, we complement sometimes, we do some scientific assessment on our own in some areas more frequently, pediatrics, orphan drugs, also scientific advice. We have a very active role, more and more in pharmacovigilance. But the committees themselves, which are the scientific bodies that make the opinion, the scientific opinion, they are made up of assessors from the member states. So the rolling review took place, and once the ETF, the Emergency Task Force, had completed its work, it went to the Committee for Approval, the CHMP, we call Committee for Human Medicines, and it granted conditional marketing authorization, or in some cases, an opinion for compassionate use. Next slide, please. So at the level of the European system itself, there were issues about shortages because, of course, the demand suddenly increased for ICU, intensive care units, medicines. Because many patients were hospitalized with very severe COVID, they needed myorelaxant, they were intubated, they needed curators to paralyze their muscles, they needed treatment of pain, opioids, and they needed antimicrobial because some of them became also super infected by bacteria. So suddenly we saw an imbalance between the supply and the demand. We don't have stores of medicine that are readily available. So, and all this medicine came from places which were in lockdown or with difficult travel or with export ban. So that was really a difficult situation. China was in lockdown. India had some restriction, first because they didn't get what they needed from China for some of the medicine, but also because themselves they put export ban to protect their own population, which is perfectly understandable. But when you're the pharmacy of the world, it creates a lot of disruption when you stop exporting. So we had a steering committee on shortages at European level, with industry telling us, informing us on what they were seeing and trying to anticipate and also know what were the alternatives, what were the critical medicines that we wanted. So we have an international group on shortages, on also raw materials, and all these were connected. We involved immediately international groups such as the International Council on Harmonization and the ICMA, which I will explain in the next, so don't be afraid with the abbreviation. This is the explanation is coming. And of course, we also started working with the Commission to support the vaccines procurement and coordination, although that was completely under the European Commission mandate and not EMA. We were consulted or informed from what was happening. Next slide, please. So the ICMA is the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authority. So it's a voluntary group of head of agencies from all over the world. And we have currently 34 members. Because it's voluntary, it does not represent, it's not as, you do not have as many countries as with WHO, but you still have members from Americas, North and South America, from Africa, from Asia, and from Europe, and we also have Australia and New Zealand. And this group existed before, and the heads of agency were there to discuss their common challenges and try to find solutions. But when the pandemic hit, these people decided to immediately step up and use that platform to work together. And also WHO is an observer, so the link with WHO was there from the outset. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We started by having technical workshop, and the first one was even as of February 2020. We had the first workshop on the requirement for vaccine development. So we immediately picked up the fact that we needed to anticipate the question from the developers that Marco has highlighted. And we gathered all these countries in an open forum, and we did two things. First, we worked together on finding the common elements, and the other thing was allowing a number of countries who normally do not have access to this information to listen and to get the information firsthand, or to even also intervene. There was nobody's bar from intervening, but we know from experience that 5 or 6 members of ICMA are more active, and the others are more on the receiving of information end. But this means that everybody had the same information, the same level, the same understanding, and that facilitated the development, because companies could not be in a situation where they find one response in one region, another response in another region, and that was quite important. Since then, we have done other technical workshops, always about vaccines on pregnancy and vaccines, vaccine safety, and of course, virus variants. We also had similar workshop on trials and treatments, and I will explain a little more after that. And we did also several workshops on observational studies and real-world evidence, because we wanted to be prepared for finding the right quality criteria for observational studies, because they have been accused in some cases of misleading, because if you have a lot of bias and confounders, you may conclude the wrong thing. And we saw that in the past, for example, for hydroxychloroquine, where the wrong conclusion was reached because the study was not of good quality. So finding the good quality elements and at the same time preparing for using real-world evidence which is necessary. When you vaccinate millions of people, you need to be able to get that information on safety. Very rare events will only emerge in that situation. Clinical trial, even with 30 or 40,000 people, are not giving you a lot of about very rare events, as we've seen recently. All our workshops were reasonably open. It was a head of agency, but also some participants, and we had 120 participants or more every time. Next slide, please. So on trials and treatments, what we did was really define what type of trial we wanted to see as regulators. We cannot rely on small trials, investigational trials that have 30 patients, 50 participants. We want thousands of patients because that's how we can conclude with robust results, and we can rely on this result. So we encourage companies and academics to engage into large trials with good design. In general, it was placebo control, it was parallel groups, it was sufficient duration to get the safety data we needed. We wanted collaborative trials, so they are bigger, and we supported the initiative from WHO in particular for master protocol. So a common protocol that can be used by various countries and regions to do a trial which can at the end normally be compiled as a big one. We define the clinically meaningful endpoint. What is, the viral load is still not considered informative enough. It may be at some point in time, it is in HIV, but for COVID, we thought at that point we wanted hard endpoints such as mortality, patient severity of the disease, hospitalization, intubation, and patient function after the disease. So these are really the one that make have some meaning for the patient. And we wanted also to make sure that subpopulation were studied. We didn't manage so well to study pregnant women. That's something we should reflect upon and maybe learn better to engage earlier with pregnant women, because women that are pregnant during COVID get COVID, and we need to know, and they need to be vaccinated, and we should get this data in a controlled environment. So we also work on not just vaccine, but also on treatments. You saw remdesivir, you saw dexamethasone, and we had a number of other monoclonal antibodies that have come since then and that becoming approved for the treatment of COVID. And we need not just to prevent, because we still have patients in ICUs, so we need also to treat these patients with product specific. So the fact that we have now a vaccine should not let us think that we have solved every problem. We need the treatment of the disease. And now we are facing different questions. For example, because of the presence of effective vaccine, how do you keep the patient, the participant in a trial when they are supposed to receive a placebo? Are they able to access the vaccine when? How do we analyze the data if they move and change groups? These are very practical questions, and at the same time, we still recognize the value of placebo-controlled trial where they can be done. And of course, all this was immediately changing because we had new data all the time, and the situation is still changing. So we've put all our information on the ICMA website, which is linked here, and that you will see for yourself. Next slide, please. We also started organizing with FDA Code Sharing, EMA and FDA, policy meeting, which were more information meetings, where we have been informed of what was taking place in each country or each region. We had a small working group preparing some of the topics more in depth, because you cannot just work in a meeting. So we had groups of people from active authorities preparing either statements to express the views of regulators, but also looking at, for example, regulatory agilities. This is a very important topic. In a situation of emergency, you tend to cut corners. If you cut corners, you may be putting patients at risk. So what we wanted is to know what was maybe cutting the red tape versus making sure that the patients are still protected. And we have looked at, for example, because of travel, which is impossible at present, we looked at remote inspection. Normally, when you do an inspection for manufacturing, you go to the manufacturing site. When you do an inspection for clinical trial, you do to the investigator site, and you look at the data yourself as an inspector. But here it's impossible. So we have been clever. We've used videos. So we're asking the company to video their manufacturing site, and we look at the video to try to detect anomalies. We have asked for photos of the patient participant in trials records. We have tried to work on digitalization, on remote inspection. So these are the kind of thing we want, and we will learn from this. Some of these aspects will stay. Others will go away because they are not safe as we would like. But they were ways of managing the situation and getting better than nothing. So, and we need to, at the same time, to take advantage of what we have been obliged to do, because in some cases it just cuts red tape. And why not remain with a cut red tape? So we have exchanged a lot of information overall between ourselves, and I think that was very useful because, again, avoid duplication, avoid uncertainty and divergences. Next, please. So we have continued also on pharmacovigilance. It was not the first priority, but now we are in the situation where we look at the safety of the vaccine and safety of the treatment. And we have also decided to collaborate. So we have created a network. We inform each other when there is an urgent safety signal. We have a way of making sure that the information gets to the top immediately. And we have also worked on communication and on vaccine confidence. We don't want to talk about vaccine hesitancy. We want to talk about vaccine confidence because we think it should be reinforced. We should engage with the public to ensure public trust in what regulators are doing. So you've seen the fantastic presentation from Marco, very clear, very simple, but also able to show the quality of the safety monitoring, because we want to make sure that we detect what is happening and that we investigate the root cause, but that we can also reassure the public on the frequency or the risks. We are also working on pregnancy and trying to get data from the women who have been exposed, but also getting proper data with pregnant women. And we are also, of course, adapting it to the emergence of virus variants. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. So the transparency has been quite essential because it allows communication. So we went far beyond what we were doing in the past. And we have, for example, at ICMA, published the discussion with companies, which normally we didn't do. We have explained when the rolling review starts, when the rolling review is completed. We have explained immediately in real time what was the outcome of the evaluation by the committee. And we have also made sure that a number of things that we have prepared as workshop outcomes, statements, were not only published, but also translated, so they would have a greater impact. And we have really worked on communication. I can tell you our communication division is extremely stretched at ICMA. And we went a little beyond what was normally confidential, and we have published a lot. But we have also engaged, and I will go back to international collaboration there. We have engaged with international partners, setting up confidentiality arrangement to allow to share information directly without asking permission, without and to be able to share our assessments, our inspection reports, and to make sure that we had immediately the information we needed and that others needed. And that ICMA has done really a dual job of working together with international partners, but also disseminating information. Next, please. So far we had more than 50 meetings. We have collaborated, and you can look back and say, did we do everything right? No, of course not. And some of the things could be weaknesses or limitation of our work. One of the weak points maybe was the fact that we haven't engaged with patients. Normally, everything we do at ICMA, we do it with patients that look at what we do, advise us, and contribute. But in this case, we were, in ICMA in particular, only with regulators. we have done other things with patient, healthcare professional, and industry. We have open platform, we have press release, we have information day. So we have still engaged, but at the level of ICMA, it was regulators only. So the advantage of being regulators only that we were able to converge very quickly on the requirement for development, and we didn't have to go from the for the process of harmonization, which normally takes weeks or months or sometimes years. Next, please. Apologies for the noise. We have automatic blinds that are shutting with the sun. So also a word of information. People believe that we started working with regulators at the time of COVID. No, we have been doing this. This is the year 2019, and every square is a day in the year. And you can see we had interaction with FDA practically every day of the year. So we are talking to regulators all the time. We're engaging, we are working with them, we are discussing our products, discussing our topics, and we have a number of ways of doing this, not just with FDA. The slide, the image is about FDA, but we do that with many regulatory authorities. We have in particular a liaison official from FDA at EMA and one from the Japanese authority PMDA at EMA. We have someone from EMA at FDA. We don't have anybody at PMDA because of the language issue. We have fellowship, which are short stays of 2-3 weeks. We have also our permanent groups working together with 2 to 7 non-EU authorities joining the group, are called clusters, and they can deal with orphan drug, with rare disease, or with pharmacovigilance, or with scientific advice. We all work in these small groups on specific products and topics. We work also at the level of platforms such as ICH, which is a group of international regulators and industry working on producing guidelines for drug development. We, of course, work a lot with WHO, and they were part of ICMA. They are part of our daily work. And once we assess the vaccines, for example, we have invited a number of regulators and WHO to join our assessment actively and to listen. And I can tell you, if you read the WHO publication for the AstraZeneca vaccine, they recognize that they actually could speed up their assessment because they work with EMA and benefited from the discussion at EMA. And of course, we do present in public and like a webinar like today. Next, please. So we have, in the normal time outside of COVID, the possibility to share our assessment and to use the principle of reliance. For those who are less familiar with the principle of reliance, it means that we share, you use the assessment done by someone else that you can trust, and you make the decision based on that. So you can decide to follow or not follow. You make the decision, so you remain in charge of your decision, but you don't repeat and duplicate the assessment. You use an assessment done by others. So we provide our assessment to many national regulatory authorities, in particular in low and middle income countries, and we give them the full report, so they don't need to assess on their own, and they can speed up and make medicines accessible to the patient faster. Next, please. So next click. Thank you. So what happened is we have also a procedure by which we assess on behalf. We do that with WHO, and we assess on behalf of countries who do not have necessarily the expertise to assess. And based on 10 opinions that we are granted with such tool, we have had 140 approvals worldwide, so licenses for medicines that have been used, as you can see from the color, for nearly everywhere in the world, and in particular in Africa, but not just in Africa, also in South America and Central America, because these products that have been used are dedicated to non-EU countries. They are intended for this. The assessment is made for use in non-EU countries, and they can grant an approval if they decide to do so based on our assessment. So this is the contribution we do to international collaboration. And of course, in the case of COVID, it hasn't been necessary to use that tool because the COVID vaccine, for example, is clearly the same, the needs are the same everywhere in the world. So we didn't need to have a special tool that would be focused more on low and middle income country. But this tool does exist and has been used widely for HIV, for malaria, for a neonatal care, for maternal care. We have a vaginal ring to protect against HIV. We have a protection of the umbilical cord at birth to avoid infections. We have malaria treatment and malaria vaccines, and so on. Next, please. So this is my last slide, and just want to conclude that clearly we cooperate, but we also collaborate. And this is part of what we do every day. But of course, in time of COVID, we have been engaging even more, going beyond, working together to make sure that we serve the needs of the world. And we have also made sure that we are transparent so the public can trust us on our decision.